So what we're going to do now is just give you a short little overview of the kind of the history of puppetry, kind of put it into perspective as far as world history goes. Going to show you where kind of the puppetry traditions have started in a couple of places. And this is absolutely not a exhaustive history of puppetry. I just want to be able to hit the highlights. Some of these things we're going to cover in more detail when we go and talk about the specific types of puppetry. But I want to go ahead and give you just a kind of a general idea. So let's go ahead and get started with that. Okay, so we're going to start out with this history. And what we're going to do is we're going to go back from today all the way back to 2400 BC. Now, a lot of this information I've got is coming from a book, and you'll see this in class, called Puppetry World History by Eileen Blumenthal. It's great text, lots of great pictures, and I'm sure you guys will be looking it over. So, but this history starts out with kind of small dolls with movable parts at least 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. There have been some small dolls of cattle that date as far back as 2400 BC. But you know, one of the problems of looking back at these very old forms of puppetry, so if we don't have written records, we can't always tell what the objects were used for. And that's a very important thing to realize when you're looking at puppetry, is these articulated figures. Now, this is a horrible picture. It's the best I could find. Let me zoom out and see if that becomes a little more clear. But these you always have to kind of guess at what they were used for. So we don't always know if something was used as a doll, a charm, a puppet, some sort of religious rite that doesn't quite mix in with puppetry. But our earliest performance record comes from Egypt, about 2000 to 1900 BC. This is in which a text describes a performance in which a walking statue represents a god. There are also tombs from the period that contain articulated figures. And here's let me show you this picture real quick. This is a picture of a figure kneading dough. This is a very famous toy that's found. And you see the string right there that's used to control it, that makes the figure move back and forth. This is kind of what would be known as an automaton. But it's probably about the 5th century BC when we hear Herodotus writing about Egyptian processions in which women are carrying puppets of Osiris. He was a fertility god. And these puppets are about 1.5 feet tall. Women would carry these around the village. What they would have to do, they would have these phalluses on them that were really not much smaller than the puppet, and they would bob up and down. And so, like most things early and religious, it had to do with fertility and sex. So now we're going to skip to 1000 BC. And we're going to move over to Asia. I kind of wanted you to see these. A lot of times the puppetry histories are kind of split up with Europe and Asia, and I wanted to kind of put them together. We find the use of puppets talked about in Asia. A performer in China is condemned to death for flirting with a royal concubine, but the actor was then spared when they were shown to be a puppet and already not alive. We have texts talking about the puppets who were used to attend to the dead, and eventually they were used by shaman as either funeral entertainers or showing. All right, so this puppet is from the 5th century BC. It's from Cyrene. It was a Greek colony, and throughout Greece it seems like puppets were popular from 5th century on. We see a lot of dolls with movable limbs. It seems that puppets played for common people in public, at banquets for the rich. In the 3rd century BC, we're talked about the puppets performing in the theater of Dionysus, at the Acropolis. So they kind of moved into a little bit more of a accepted theatrical realm. This is a Greek figure from the 3rd century, and compare that. Kind of this more primitive from 2 centuries before. The Greeks had hand-manipulated figures as well as these kind of elaborate automatons. And automatons are puppets that are controlled just by strings. They're not as expressive, but they could be, they would do ships and battles, things like that. Some of the automatons were powered by water. Greek writers also record that Daedalus made wooden dolls that had movable parts for King Minos, so that shows that these kind of dolls and these kind of puppets were were known to the writers. There's also evidence that puppets performed for both entertainment and ceremonies in Hellenic times. There's also some circumstantial evidence of shadow puppetry. This is from the Platonic ideals, when he talks about Socrates' understanding of the real world, the ideal world versus the world that we have right now. Socrates talks about people seeing only the shadows of things, shadows of the ideal that are manipulated by puppet masters. So we kind of get the sense that this idea of this form of puppetry was known. And these are some 4th century dolls from modern Turkey. So this would be about the 300 AD. At this time, what you're seeing is the kind of Roman Christian times. And early Christian authorities really hated puppetry. They thought it smacked of idolatry and fun. Also, female puppets raised the idea of carnal desire. You see a lot of puppets engaged in sex or flirting and that kind of thing. It happens a lot through shows. So through the Middle Ages, folk puppeteers, which are usually gypsies or Jews, survived. So there's kind of, again, this idea of the itinerant puppeteer. They were by legal statute the most vile class, on par with people who exhibited monkeys or dogs, trained monkeys or dogs. They were even low class by the standards of normal entertainers. So you can see how puppetry was really looked down on. At the same time, in Japan, you see this Hanawa figure, which are the early centuries, early Common Era or AD, and these were buried with people as attendants to kind of worked into the idea of what became the normal standard puppetry. Throughout Japan's history, they had these foreign puppeteers, mostly from Korea, that came in and worked to become a kind of distinctive form of puppetry. For the Japanese puppetry, which we'll talk about. The Song Dynasty in China, which lasted from 960 to 1279, let puppets play in designated entertainment areas and along roadsides. This is a picture of a later Chinese puppet here, but you get the idea there. The puppets also at this time were playing in wealthy homes and at court. They were still considered low class. But this Chinese influence spread throughout Asia. As I said, Korea and Japan soon developed forms. India at this point has a strong shadow theater, as well as this kind of idea of marionettes starting. And then back in good old Europe is about 1300 AD. The Synod of Trier encouraged enactments of the Bible. The church had become to embrace this idea of puppetry as a way to illustrate Bible stories, because the Bible stories were so kind of fantastical. Crucifixes could bleed in a way you can't make people bleed. The Blessed Virgin, you can make her weep. And here we've got this later puppet form. This is Sicilian marionette theater, and you see the soldiers kind of struck dumb by the resurrected Christ. So puppets at this point were playing Holy Ghost or souls, and then by the 16th century, whole puppet plays were being performed. And in fact, by the 16th century, live-action religious plays were banned in England and in France. So at this point, it's all puppetry all the time. At the same time this is happening in Turkey, we get Chargas, I believe that's how you pronounce it, which is a shadow theater starring one central character named Chargas, who's kind of the commedia idea, but for shadow puppetry in Turkey. He is introduced, and this is again a very bad picture of what he has, but we'll talk about him in class more. And he is, this character, a lot of comedy, very entertaining. So at the same time, whereas in Christian Europe you've got these very serious religious plays being performed, in Turkey you're seeing the shadow theater, you're really embracing this popular form. By the late 16th century, this is 1500s, Bunraku is starting to be established. By the 18th century, it's fully fleshed out, and you have the three puppeteers controlling one, and this is something we'll spend a lot of time on. This is a very famous form of puppetry in Japan, very formalized, very beautiful form. Where you see you have three puppeteers performing and holding and manipulating each puppet. And that again is starting in the 16th century, the 1500s. By the 1700s, it is a fully fleshed out form of theater. The 18th century in Europe, which is, this is the 1700s, you see a rise of shadow puppets in Europe, and a lot of that is coming from the Middle Eastern influence from the Crusades that have come along. Puppet theater and live action theater have survived alongside each other for the next several hundred years. They kind of follow parallel tracks. Commedia characters find their way on the puppet stage. Sometimes they change their name, sometimes not. These are some 19th century hand puppets from France, but you can kind of see the way they the kind of popular style of them. The 18th century, as I say, you see the rise of shadow puppets. The 19th century, you start to see this rise of romanticism, and that should be a capital R, romanticism, and the love of the primitive, which led to a rise of puppet theater for children. Then you lead to a rise of realism in the 19th century, which forces puppetry to embrace the side of theater they could do really well, because the idea was that puppets could only be suited for children because that was fantasy. Puppets couldn't perform realism well. They just don't do it well. It's just not in their, obviously in their nature. So a lot of puppeteers settle into the role of entertaining children. And then in the early 20th century, with this kind of this idea that it was only for children, puppetry had a kind of hard time surviving, as an art form. And then in the early 20th century, you've got puppets were popular in vaudeville, things like that. And it wasn't until kind of this inspiration from Asia hit in the 20th century that puppetry in the Western world really started to rise up. Here's a picture of a German hand puppet theater from 1886. You can see behind. And it's very obviously Punch and Judy, very violent kind of show. You see the other puppets hanging here in the back. You can see the club and the slapstick. And again, this idea that it couldn't be realistic. It's puppetry. So you have this mock violence that they're able to show that they couldn't normally. And then until today, what we have is kind of this renaissance of puppet theater, where this Eastern traditions have really come in strong and helped out the Western traditions, to revitalize them, shown them kind of what it could do. So what you have is this idea that all the way from the religious roots coming back to this really artistic. So as I said, that's the very short history of what puppet theater has to offer, and as I said, we'll get in more specifically into them as we move along through the semester, as we kind of evaluate each type of form. We'll get more deeply into the history, but hopefully that gives you a good overview of what the puppet history is as far as theater. And again, if you have questions, we'll answer those in class or email. And then in the next series of lectures, we'll start going into each specific style of puppetry.